I'm only a little bit terrified, so it's fine. Thank you, thanks. So I'm so excited to be here today. It's such an honor to have been invited to moderate this panel with three absolutely phenomenal women leaders from the Arctic. My name is Patricia Johnson-Castle. My family is from Nunavut in the northeastern subarctic, I suppose. And so I was invited to moderate this panel because I'm a graduate of the Gordon Foundation's Jane Glasgow Northern Policy Fellowship. And so in this, through the Jane Glasgow program, I researched on how to improve workplaces for Inuit women. It's absolutely fabulous to be able to discuss some of the issues I had the opportunity to research with such a wonderful panel. So many of you already know some of our panelists, but I'll give a brief introduction. Her Excellency, the Right Honorable Mary May Simon, as I have just confirmed, we are distant cousins, was sworn in on July 26, 2021 as Canada's first Indigenous Governor-General. She's the 30th Governor-General since Confederation. Mary was born in Kongaksuludrak, Nunavik, and she has gained national and international recognition for her work on Arctic and Indigenous issues and for her efforts in advocating for Inuit rights, youth education, and culture. Also with us is Katrín Jakobsdóttir, who has served as Prime Minister of Iceland since November 2017 and is the second woman to hold the Prime Ministership in this country. And previously she served as the Minister of Education, Science, Culture, and the Minister for Nordic Cooperation. One of the other things I love about really small governments is how many portfolios you get to hold at once, you know? And because similarly, Naaja Nathanielsen, who is the current Naaja Minister, otherwise known as Minister for, again, Housing, Infrastructure, Minerals, Justice, and Gender Equity in Greenland. And previously, she served as the Director of Prisons, Probation, and Probation Services in Greenland before becoming a Member of Parliament. So thank you all for joining us today. I believe each of you have prepared some remarks to share with us. So why don't we start with Her Excellency and move down the panel.
Good morning, everybody. Urulakut. Thank you for that kind introduction. Yeah, it was amazing to find out I was your distant relative. Maybe it's not so distant. So I just want to thank everyone for being here and also for inviting me to be on this panel. I think, as we've heard over the last day or so, our success really, locally and globally, relies on contributions of diverse voices, and I think it's really important to talk about that. I spent much of my life raising the profile and voices of Inuit in Canada, as well as internationally. And right now in Canada, we're very involved in reconciliation, which is a very important issue in Canada and involves both Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians working together to talk about the past and how we move forward together. So part of reconciliation is listening and learning from each other. It's telling our stories and our truth. And what I mean by that is that it's about an ongoing conversation about getting to know one another and being able to respect and give space to different cultures and different languages. And in Canada, we have many diverse people, many diverse Indigenous people, as well as new Canadians or Canadians that have moved to Canada many years ago. So we embrace that as a country, and we are working very hard to bring a new change to the future of the country so that we can strengthen our country as a diverse nation. And it's really, being involved and engaged in the country's future. The healthier and more prosperous we become, our country's future becomes more vibrant. And our future in the Arctic, as an Arctic nation, will also rest on the success of Indigenous people. And I can remember back in the day when the Inuit Circumpolar Council began in '77, it was just Inuit talking together about the concerns they had about their future. And over time, that discussion started to include Indigenous or non-Indigenous people, like governments from Arctic nations. And today we have a very diverse group of people here engaged in discussions of what the nation is about, what the world is about, what the Arctic nation is about, and what kind of success we are building for the Arctic region, which includes the Indigenous voice as an integral piece of that conversation. So, in terms of globally, reconciliation means renewing and strengthening relationships and finding new opportunities to work together for the common good. And I've been listening to a lot of the conversations and the discussions here, and it is about that. It is about finding new opportunities and working together for the common good. It's the Arctic that we're talking about. The Arctic is integral to world peace. The Arctic is integral to climate change. The Arctic is integral to Indigenous people that make it their home, and non-Indigenous people as well. So it is for the common good that we are here. And gender equality is part of that. And I'm really pleased to see us working together on this issue. It is a very important issue. Years ago, when I was often the only woman in the room, when I first got involved in politics in my own region, fighting not only for Inuit rights, but also just to be heard. That was a big challenge. And today I see men and women, young people and older people, all working together. And there's been a tremendous change. It's a sea change, really, in the development of our relationship between men and women and people, the need to work together on critical issues that face us as well as in our communities. Our communities have to be healthy. Our communities have to be vibrant. And I think that's one of the ways we can assert our own Arctic presence. And that's really important. I just want to tell a little story about one person on one occasion that I had to confront a man who was mistreating me. And he was talking down to me, dismissing what I had to say. And I really had to persist. I couldn't back down, and I didn't feel I should back down. And eventually, the situation changed, and I overcame the adversity that I was confronted with, because I really had to do that. And that's been a pattern in my own career as a woman, that I've had to fight for my presence in many, many dialogues. I'll give you another quick story. When I was the ICC chair, there was a meeting in Yellowknife, an Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy meeting. It was chaired by Canada because they were hosting it. I was invited to present a paper on the role of Indigenous people in the Arctic through this AEPS. And when I got there, I thought I was a participant in the discussions. I was asked not to sit at the table because I was only there to present a paper. So I didn't agree with that, obviously. I can be pretty stubborn when it comes to things like that. I kept presenting my case, And I couldn't get what I was asking for, so I got up and walked out of the room, and there was a CBC reporter outside the room, and I was going straight for him to tell my story, and the chairman of the meeting came out and said, "Mary, let's go and talk about this." And at the end, I was able to participate. So that was a breakthrough. So those are the things that I think really make a difference in terms of building partnerships between men and women. I think my story is a similar story for women across Canada and really around the world. We fought to have our voices heard and to get a seat at the table. When women do succeed, it is to everyone's benefit. To the world's credit, women are becoming more and more involved in all industries and are taking on more leadership positions. But full gender equality has not yet been achieved. We must work together to ensure full parity for women and for diverse minority groups. This will lead to social, economic, and cultural benefits for all of us. Canada and Iceland will continue to work together to find new ways to amplify the voices that are too often silenced. And I really look forward to speaking with members of this panel about their experiences and how they see the future. Thank you.
Nakumik for your remarks. My former boss when I worked for Nunatsiavut government, I would say is the informal archivist in that she never throws anything out. And so there was this little lookbook that was a quick history of the James Bay Agreement. And I can confirm that Her Excellency was the only woman. There was one picture of her, and it was the only picture of a woman in the whole little book. So that was before she was appointed. And so when she was, I was, oh, the woman from the book. And now the woman from the book is on the stage with me. And so next we'll hear from the Prime Minister.
Thank you. I'm just looking at this room. And I think a few years ago, we wouldn't have a full hall at the Arctic Circle talking about gender equality and diversity. And I think what we are seeing is a real change in gender equality and diversity issues coming out from the periphery, and they are now into mainstream politics. I remember when I began in Parliament in 2007, gender equality was an absolute side issue. Absolute side issue. Nobody was really talking about it except for some crazy ladies to the left in politics usually, but also in other parties. And they were talking about gender equality, feminism, women's rights, and the men didn't talk about it. But what has happened here, at least in Iceland, is the fact that before last election, every chair of a political party was asked, "Are you a feminist?" And I think they all said they were. I'm not sure if they are really deep down feminists, I don't know. But I think this is actually a very important change, that it has become mainstream to think about gender equality and diversity. And why is that? Well, first and foremost, when it comes to gender equality, it's because of the women who have been fighting relentlessly for the rights of women. It didn't just happen. It didn't just happen, and it didn't come from nowhere. It's about women's solidarity, and what we have seen in Iceland is actually the fact that many important changes have come about because women from different layers in society, different parties have united and made that change happen. I'm talking about universal childcare, I'm talking about shared parental leave. This is what makes the difference for women, because gender equality is not about exceptional women getting results. It's about all women getting the same opportunities as all men. That's what gender equality is really about. And obviously it's the right thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. But I think also that when we experience a table where decisions are made, where we have both men and women, and best it would be to have all genders around the table, we get better decisions. I can mention one example now, coming out of the pandemic, where we in Iceland actually had a very diverse table making the decisions. I think that was really a crucial point for our results in dealing with the pandemic, was the fact that we had that diversity around the table, that we were listening to different perspectives and making decisions built on that diverse table. How is that related to the Arctic? Because many think about the Arctic as something, you know, why should we talk about diversity and gender equality in the Arctic? Well, obviously, as my colleague here says, we have a very diverse people living around the Arctic, and no decision should be made about the Arctic without the participation of the indigenous people who have built their existence on the sensitive ecosystems in the Arctic. And it is really our common duty to ensure that they can build a sustainable economy around the Arctic. And this is a very important part, and I must say that now, because Iceland has been a homogeneous society for quite some time, but we are getting more and more diverse with more and more immigrants, that we are, for example, looking to Canada and how we can actually become a good, diverse society. And there are so many decisions that need to be made around the Arctic, considering the well-being of the people, the economy, the balance between nature, environment, and those issues, that will be better decisions with men and women around the table. Just one point I would like to mention is actually the project Gender Equality in the Arctic that was initiated by the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Iceland and is part of the organization of this panel. And we are now actually going into phase 4 in that project. And phase 4 is about identifying the challenges when it comes to gender data and to work with indigenous experts to promote a dialogue on issues of specific importance to indigenous communities. And I think when we look at this project, how important it has been really for the politicians and policymakers to make decisions that are built on diversity. So my final point, because I want to have some time for questions too, we need research. We need to tread carefully when we are making decisions about the Arctic, because it's such a diverse area, such a sensitive area. So we need to build really on knowledge, data, and research.
Nakumik, for your comments. I think that it's so true that when there's a win for women and there's a win for the people who are most marginalized in our society, that improves the quality of life for everyone. And one of the ways that my research was inspired was by the work of the African-American feminist Angela Davis, because she says that that African-American women have to understand themselves, they have to understand white men, they have to understand white women, and then they have to understand African-American men. And so I thought to myself, well, as an Inuk woman, you know, I have to understand, you know, and so I think that, you know, if we are able to, it's very exciting that the fourth pillar and the next steps for gender equality are, I think, really rooted in that philosophy, because I think it will make a more livable, humane planet for all of us, and a more humane Arctic for all of us. And now we'll hear from Minister Naaja.
Thank you, and you actually just made my point.
Great minds think alike.
So let me start by saying that the Arctic is in itself diverse, and it consists of many different regions and countries. And we have to be mindful of this, because what I'm about to say also concerns culture and history. And I know this is very diverse in the Arctic. I'm often confronted with the idea that matters of diversity and gender equality are soft topic compared to matters of economy and commerce, you know, the real problems and issues. But if diversity and gender equality truly is subjects of lesser importance, it is curious how often I am met with very strong reactions when addressing this topic. Because every time I have presented concrete political action to increase diversity or promote gender equality, I have been told that this agenda will somehow weaken our economy and destroy good governance. And I call this the fact-free comfort zone of status quo. In Greenland, our colonial past has strongly influenced the way we perceive and discuss inequality, and it has not always been to the benefit of women. Thus, the right to vote and the right to political representation came quite late to women in Greenland. And the women emancipation movement in the 60s and 70s did not really take hold in Greenland as well, and most likely that was because most of the political energy and capital was invested in the political debate with the Danish state about the governance of Greenland. Mm-hmm. So it seems there were only room for one conflict and the women had to hold back. But since then, the children of Greenland has been taught our colonial history and learned to identify the patterns of inequality that arises from this. So these patterns of inequality are usually verbalized and acknowledged widely. So people living in Greenland frequently will discuss examples of cultural inequality and the way it plays out in the work field, in the educational system, in the political arena, and so on. And it is my hypothesis that women in Greenland are beginning to connect the dots and see the similarities between this debate and gender-biased structures. Mm-hmm. So it could be a controversial thought that our history has prepared girls and women to navigate unequal power structures and tackle them. And maybe this goes for other Arctic countries and territories as well, because in preparation for this speech, I went through the program for this assembly, and the number of female presenters are truly amazing in comparison to any other conference that matter or contains issues of economy, environment, research, and so on, the real issues. So furthermore, this goes for all the attending segments, both politicians, government officials, NGOs, researchers, and so on. So in Greenland, women are achieving leadership in all sectors, private and public, and on the cultural scene, and they all had to fight for it, because female achievement does not come cheap, and challenging power structures never does. But these women done it nonetheless, and the country is better because of it. The dialogue gets more balanced with different voices and different ideas, and I call this the necessary discomfort zone for any region, body, or company that wants change. For tragic reasons, many of us are familiar with patterns of cultural inequality, and we are capable of discussing it and addressing it and the problems that arises from it. And this knowledge can be applied to target other types of inequalities as well, and I believe that this process has begun. So we have to acknowledge that some people have been carving this path for decades. So in conclusion, I would like to thank my fellow panelists for carving the way. Thank you, and I think we should give them an applause.
Thank you so much for all your remarks. I think it gives our audience a lot to think about. I'll maybe start off the questions, and then I believe there are people with microphones, so if there are members of the audience who would like to ask questions to our very esteemed panel, you can find your way to mics, or mics can find your way to you if you raise your hand to ask a question. So I used to live in South Africa, and one of the things I learned while I was living there is that, or that helped me think through, is when discrimination happens, it benefits some people, right? Like, so we get discriminated against as women, and that means that more men get to have experiences in leadership positions, or they get advanced at work, or these kinds of things. So I was wondering if any of you could speak to, what do you think it is the role of men when it comes to facilitating and creating gender equality?
I think the role of men is highly important. That has actually been part of the Icelandic policy for years, because as always, when one group has a privilege, it's very difficult to really give up that privilege. So it's highly important to really get men into the debate, and that's what we have been doing, not least when it comes to the core issues like gender-based violence, equal pay, sexual and reproductive rights. We really need the men to take an active part in that discussion. And that is quite a challenge, actually. But the results will be better because obviously it isn't, it's for the common good, it's for the benefit of us all to ensure gender equality. But it is a challenge because it's always difficult when you're in a privileged position to give that up.
I think.
Yes, exactly. It's about the power structure and how you must decline from some of your privileges. And I think this also calls for men to try to imagine that a world could be seen in a different way and that there could be different perspectives than your own. And it requires quite a lot for an individual. So I think it also calls for some courage for men to try and think outside the box, if you will.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Could I say a few words?
Yeah. Microphone. Okay, microphone is coming to you.
Yes, good day. My name is Stefan Magnusson. I am actually a citizen of Greenland and Iceland. And my spouse is also a foreigner living here in Iceland. And she has told me the Icelandic Foreign Institute is a very difficult institution to work with. She has actually been living here for 3 years, speaks fluent Icelandic. And she also mentioned other incidences of foreign students in Iceland. Some of them come from Russia that have been here for 3, 4, 5 years as students. And when they finish their education, they have absolutely no rights of continuing living here in this country, even if they dearly want so. So I'm very happy that Katrín is talking with Canada about how to integrate immigrants or students in Iceland like Canada does into Icelandic society. I just wanted to point this out. And also another gender inequality existing both in Iceland and more so in Greenland is that the fishing fleet is dominated by men. And when women are applying for positions on like factory trawlers or other jobs on the ocean, they don't get hired because of their gender. Thank you.
I think we have seen some of the Me Too movement has really targeted different sectors. And I think the fishing industry and really the work at sea has been some of the latest to come out and realize they have a problem and they need to tackle this. Because being on a boat in a confined space is very difficult. It's difficult enough for women to have to speak up on land, but on sea it's really difficult. So kudos to those who are doing it.
Yeah, I'm very lucky that in my family I have a cousin who is a fisherwoman who owns her own fishing enterprise, but she is definitely the exception, right? The fact that I can point to the one woman who is a Nunatsiavut, who owns a business that is fishing is a problem, right? We want to have a plurality of that.
But I think this example shows really that gender equality is not something that you can keep in one office. It's something that needs to be in every office. So we need to think about gender equality when we talk about fish and agriculture and transport and every sector. And otherwise we really won't get there. We won't achieve gender equality unless we think about gender equality in every decision we make. So I think that's something, but obviously just as people a few years ago said, why should we talk about gender equality and the Arctic? We maybe are still confronted with the fact that people think, why should we talk about fish and gender equality? But it's hugely important that we do just that.
Yeah, just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. Her Excellency wanted to comment.
Thank you. If I could just maybe bring in another component of equality for the discussion. And the minister mentioned that equal power structures and more balanced approach is very important. I totally agree with that. But when you look at what's happening in our communities, like people working on social issues, people working on mental health, on health issues, in my region anyway, it's mostly women. So we're looking at a structure at the top level where mostly men have have been attracted to that. But now when you peel the layers, you start to see where the women actually have been very, very powerful in their own way, dealing with people at the community level, addressing issues that are impacting families. And that is one of the things that I don't think really gets very much attention. And we often say in my region, where have the men gone? Because now, as women, I think we need to be sensitive to the issue of where are the men going? Because we're talking about an equal opportunity, equal society, and it's always been about us women because it had to be. But now in regional or community level, we see mostly women being in the education field, in the health field, in the social development of the communities. Mental health is a really big one because we have such challenges facing young people today in the north that we need to have a much better balance on how we address those. So there have been some movement to start men's organizations, like we had to do at the beginning. But we're still, there's an imbalance happening somewhere else, so that's what I wanted to say.
I think the minister wanted to make a comment, but also just briefly, I think what Her Excellency is alluding to as well is like the diverse impact, I guess, of colonialism on gendered issues, because this is one of the things that came up in my research was that women face specific challenges in the workplace because of some of the structures. Women tend to be responsible for childcare, so having inflexible workplaces makes that more difficult. But then at the same time that Inuit men particularly have been displaced by colonialism because historically Inuit men would provide by hunting, but now it's so expensive to go hunting that you need a day job to be able to afford a snowmobile, the gas, the bullets, etc. But then if you have a day job, you don't have time to go hunting. So then it's very difficult to navigate those nuances of like being displaced from being able to provide, and then the way that that impacts the mental health of I think particularly Inuit men in the Arctic. But the minister wanted to add something, I believe.
Yeah, I just wanted to see that this is exactly the thing about the patterns you need to identify, because the gender segregated labor market is one problem that is very connected to a lot of other issues connecting to women: sexual abuse, gender-based violence, stereotypical gender roles. And it all plays together, and you have to address it as a whole and see this as a pattern of power structure to address it successfully. And I think so when we talk about a gender-segregated labor market, it is directly linked to when the media is overflown by pictures of a prime minister dancing and having fun. It's all about the same pattern.
Yeah, women aren't allowed to have fun. No.
In public.
That would be terrible.
Horrible. I think we have time for one more question from the audience, if someone with a microphone. Maybe, the person in the, Sure, yep.
Thank you. Rachel Johnston, University of Akureyri, Iceland, and Elisabeth Safik. My question is to Your Excellency, the Governor General. You mentioned reconciliation as a process and a partnership between Indigenous and settler Canadians. I wonder if you have some messages that can help the Nordic countries and in convincing their settler populations also to engage in reconciliation and realize this is about them. There are processes I'm sure you're familiar with, but so far there's been very little engagement by settler people in the Nordic states and Danes vis-a-vis Greenland. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think we have to look at each country and its history individually first. And Canada has had a difficult time because we are opening up historical issues that have been very damaging to Indigenous peoples in Canada. And Canada had to open its mind. And I think there are different events that happened in Canada that provided some of these openings. For instance, the government decided to have a commission on Truth and Reconciliation, and it gave its report, and there's some pretty important information and recommendations in that report. As well, recently, and then there was a court case with residential school students against the churches and the government, and that also opened doors. As well as recently, there have been unmarked graves that have been found in Canada on near old residential schools that are unmarked with no names. And that has really started a very important discussion across the country, where when I was appointed as Governor General, there were thousands of messages that came in for me that made me see and realize that Canada was much more ready than I thought to talk about what reconciliation is. Reconciliation, I think, has to be a process where all the parties are open to the discussion, not just Indigenous people. We always say in Canada, it's not an Indigenous issue, it's a Canadian issue. And that is the premise of the discussions that I've been having and will continue to have over my mandate. It's about building relationships to be able to be respectful and give space to people that have not had that space and the respect in the country. And it's allowing for that space to develop so that cultures, Indigenous people especially, but other cultures as well, that we do live in a very diverse country now, is to have that space so that people can continue to exercise their rights, their culture, and their language in a way that is respected by others, and that there's equal opportunity for jobs, other opportunities, better systems developed in our own country, which we have been working on for a long time now. But it's an evolution, it's a development, it has no end. But people have to agree that this is an important thing that each of our countries needs to do with their citizens.
Thank you so much for your comments. I'd like to thank all members of our panel for a wonderful discussion for pan-Arctic gendered issues. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister and her office for the opportunity to be on this panel and having put this panel together. And I think we have a lot to continue to learn from each other. So this is just the beginning, and I'm excited for the next steps in the Arctic Circle's gendered research and focus.
And then we will have more men.
Yeah, and then
in
men.
the next panel
yes.
discussion on gender equality.
Yes,
so
yeah. Where are the men?